last year you stepped down from your role at the FA after 30 years at the helm, taking women's football from pretty much not in the greatest of places to where it is today, which is obviously in such a strong position. Can you take us back to when you first got involved in football? What was it that made you stay in the game for such a long period of time?
Well, I wasn't allowed to play as a girl. I think that's one of my big drivers, really, for wanting to make sure that this generation had better opportunities. My brother played football and cricket. They were the two sports I wanted to play. When I went to school, I had to play netball. So, there was no girls' teams around. So I didn't really plan to work in football, obviously. I went to university, captained the side, got my coaching qualifications, ended up in football sort of very late. Got a call from the FA because there's very few qualified female coaches at that point, saying was I interested in a job. I remember ringing my dad and he was so excited about going to Lancaster Gate, which was the FA's HQ at the time, and was always on TV, that he said he'd take me. So off I went to Lancaster Gate, had a chat with them, accepted the job there and then, and went into work in women's football. So yeah, no plan, dream come true. Couldn't believe my luck, the chance to work in the game as well as play and coach it. And I think the first sort of key leadership role was working with Howard Wilkinson, who was technical director at the time. That was when we counted that there were 80 girls and women's teams in the whole country. There was a women's national league that was amateur. There was an England senior team that, of course, had amateur players in it and some staff that they borrowed from the men's game on the rare occasions that the team met. And that was it. And so my job with Howard, well, obviously we appointed Hope Powell as first full-time national coach. We put the England youth teams in the Girls' Centres of Excellence that some of the Lionesses came through, or many of the Lionesses came through, that won the Euros, and then started to build the pathway and put, and then really focus along with government funding, trying to get girls' schools teams, girls' clubs teams. It was hard work, because even if you created a girls' team, they had no one to play, so you had to create the league and lots of teams. So it was, and of course lots of cultural barriers still then about girls playing football, but amazing times because you got the chance to sort of put your stamp on the pathway. And it was brilliant working with Hope and some amazing women and male allies to start to build the game.
When you came in at that moment and where the women's game was, what were the immediate priorities? Because I imagine, it's hard to kind of look at where it is now and compare it to where it was then. Like, I'm sure there were the ambitions to get to that level, but the immediate priorities, what were they?
I think it was, I suppose it was putting the pathway in place, because literally nothing. So there was nothing to identify and develop talented young players. There was literally some pockets of club football, really predominantly adult football from sort of brave women who were kind of going against the societal grain, and a senior England team. That was it. So I think building the pathway and then providing opportunities for girls to play, so widening the base, giving girls that opportunity. So working really, really hard to get women into coaching, get teachers to introduce football, start to get introductory sessions and girls teams in place, and just try and widen that base, and then obviously from there identify the more talented ones to go into the centres of excellence that were developed in partnership with the professional clubs. At that point, the community programmes in the professional clubs were sort of gold dust, really. They were the ones developing girls and women's teams and putting the centres of excellence in, which are now sort of more integrated in the whole club, but tended to be through those community programmes. So working with partners really who could help make very, very little money go further.
I know the game has obviously had moments where it's grown exponentially quite quickly, but you must have had to be really patient at the beginning, knowing that these things aren't going to happen overnight and knowing what the goals were and how long it might take for those things to be achieved.
Yeah, I think sort of when I look back, there were a number of challenges. I think one was the fact that societally it was just seen to be a sport for boys and men. So you were sort of challenging those gender norms, pushing those kind of social barriers, and trying to make women and girls football visible, and trying as much as you could with the England women's team, who were sort of the most high profile, trying to make them as visible as possible so that people could see that girls and women could play and that there were opportunities to play. And I think, there was very little money. The FA didn't have the sorts of revenues that it's got now. And there was an attitude, I think, and a lack of ambition around the women's game from many in there that meant that it was really sort of, you're operating on peanuts budget-wise. So, you know, without sort of Sport England as it is now, sort of government money alongside the FA, we probably wouldn't have got to where we've got to. And then obviously when the lottery started, that made a massive difference as well, because that helped us to invest in the talent programme. But yeah, I think lack of money, lack of ambition about what women's football could be, and those cultural barriers made it quite tough. I don't know if I was patient, but I just, you know,
You must have been.
Determined, I think.
You talked a lot there about some of the challenges that you face, and obviously I can only imagine some of the battles that went on behind the scenes to kind of push and drive that change forwards. But I'd really like to sort of get a bit of a view from you about what some of your biggest wins were during your time. I mean, there's so many options to choose from. You talked about sort of establishing the England youth teams there, and sort of how that created the pathway into the Lionesses, and the, you know, the Euros win is a big one. You know, the World Cup final was massive, and sort of, you know, seeing some of that work that you did lay the foundations for the successes that we now see. But from your perspective, what can you give us a couple of your biggest wins over your career time?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm obviously sort of, if people sort of know of the work that I did in the FA, they'll sort of associate me with women's football. But I was actually director of men's and women's development for quite a long time, and we changed the way that children play football, which I'm really proud of, because children went into 11-a-side football ridiculously young, on huge pitches with massive goals, and never touched the ball. And so I think this has had an impact, not just for girls, but for boys as well. But we did a really extensive research project on what we think was the right format and way that children should play football, and at what ages, and together. And I wrote about this in The Guardian because of the role of Gareth Southgate helping to get it through council. But and this guy called Nick Levitt, who was phenomenal, who was head of youth in our team, and together we sort of changed it and mandated 5v5, 7v7, going up to 9v9, so that children had much better development. And I think that, alongside the centres of excellence for girls that became the regional talent centres, meant that there was a really good sort of introduction and pipeline of talent coming through that would sort of help England and the WSL. So I think I was really proud of that work around the pathway. And then I think probably the biggest challenge I had was going in September 2018 to run the WSL, to be director of the Women's Pro Game. I'd actually been really, really poorly before then. I'd nearly, a long story which I won't bore you with, but I'd nearly died in a hospital in Spain a couple of months before. So I'd been off work for a couple of months, and I was changing jobs. And I came in the September. And it was a fantastic, very, very, very small team of people who were working tirelessly, predominantly to sort of put the fixtures out and implement the rules. But there was no strategy for the WSL. There literally was zero revenue. There's no sponsorship. There'd been a bit of a sort of bundled TV deal with BT Sport, which had been bundled with a men's deal where they showed the occasional games. The clubs were so hacked off with what the FA had been doing. I'd been in director of men's and women's development, so I'd just come back over into WSL. That they told me just before I started that they were planning to walk the clubs out the door. So I went, okay, well, wait, give me a chance to get in and have a look. And together we built out a vision and plan for the WSL, signed Barclays quite quickly, which was, huge because of the amounts of revenue and I think the credibility I think it gave the WSL. It was a global record deal at the time. I think it gave people faith that we could actually do something. And then, of course, we went on and did the Sky and BBC deal. And then alongside that, ran a review of what was the right ownership model, and made a recommendation to the board that it should be a club-owned entity with the clubs who are the majority investors, shaping their future with some caveats around sort of protections that the FA would have. So, yeah, it was 5 incredible years before sort of handing the baton over to Nikki and WPLL, of taking it from zero to sort of a multi-million-pound business, and putting the WSL on the map. So I think they were very special times, absolute crazy. I think 7 days a week madness. but yeah, incredibly rewarding to see it fly.
I was going to say, and I think as you know, recognition of all the achievements that you made in your time. I think obviously you getting the OBE, the MBE as well. I mean, what was that like, picking up some of those kind of massive awards that we all kind of dream of even sort of getting anywhere near? I mean, that must have been insane. Can you talk us through how that moment was?
Well, yeah, it was lovely. The MBE was my mum and dad. Well, my mum's still alive. My dad was alive then, so it's really lovely to be able to go with them, who've been so supportive of my career, to go with them to Buckingham Palace and collect it. And the OBE was, I wasn't expecting at all, and I was able to go with my wife to collect that. So really lucky. I know people sort of say this, but it genuinely was a team effort, and so you're very much sort of collecting on behalf of an incredible group of people that worked absolutely tirelessly to put women's football on the map. And I was just lucky enough to lead the team, and so you sort of get. Sometimes you get the custard pies when it's not going well, and the threats on social media, but of course you get the accolades as well. But it was very much a team effort. But it was lovely to share that, with my loved ones. So wow. Very lucky.
When you look back at your time at the FA, was there a turning point where you felt like the momentum behind women's football started to shift, not just from a fan perspective, but in the boardrooms as well? I know if you talk to people in the game, we often have different memories of when we felt things shifted a bit, whether it was the 2012 Olympics or the 2015 World Cup, or maybe it was when England first hosted the Euros all the way back in 2005. I don't know, like what were those moments for you where you started to feel like the dial was shifting both on and off the pitch?
Yeah, I think there's a few really. I think hosting the Euros way back when, the World Cup in Canada I think was definitely one, because the kick-off times here weren't great, but millions of people were watching really, really late at night, and England were progressing through the tournament and probably doing better maybe than people expected, and probably should have got to the World Cup finals.
Well, yeah, the way they went out was the thing, right? That's what got everyone talking.
Yeah, and of course picked up the bronze medal, and and it was incredible. And I think from there everybody, the public knew about the Lionesses, I think, and sort of fell in love with them and their grit and determination. And the men's team weren't doing so well at that point, so there was a lot of pride about the Lionesses, both internally and across the nation. So I think that really felt like a moment. It was also that we'd just had a new chief exec appointed, Martin Glenn, who came out to Canada with us, and could see the potential of women's football and made some big commitments about what the FA would do, and honoured those and invested in them. And so it felt like a really key moment, because there was finally leadership that genuinely made the FA feel like it was the governing body of men's and women's football. And women's football wasn't this sort of thing that we have to do and on the side of the desk and put a little bit of funding in and hope we all shut up. It was genuinely a culture shift going on in the FA, and a prioritisation shift and a resource shift. And that was massive, because that meant we could start to really fund things at the level that would help drive transformational change.
Sometimes you forget sort of what goes into making and developing an infrastructure that's that big, that kind of has this lasting impact. If you could go back to the start of your career at the FA, is there anything you'd do differently? And not in the sense that there's any kind of regrets or mistakes that were made, but I suppose more learnings, of things. Sort of you look back on retrospectively and think, oh, maybe we could have done it that way and a little bit differently, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, as a sort of a generic one, I think I do, wonder, should we have demanded more? Should we have been bolder? Should we have sort of pushed for more earlier? You're trying constantly, when you're in an organisation that's on its own journey of change, you're trying to sort of push and cajole to get more support, more financial support, but without annoying the people so much that you fall through the trapdoor and suddenly find you've gone because you've annoyed them too much. And I do sort of wonder, at times maybe, should have pushed for more, been bolder. But no regrets really. I think obviously when we introduced the WSL, we had some really interesting debates about how we should do it. Should it be a summer league? How many teams? Should it be closed? Do you put a licence criteria in? All of those, that whole sort of history of the WSL that I probably should write about one day, because I was sort of in on the inside trying to work out what was the best thing, and no regrets around that. I think it was really difficult because it meant some really difficult decisions, and it made it really hard for clubs who didn't have a men's part of the club that was prepared to invest. It meant that those clubs, I suppose like the Doncaster Bells, sort of fell down the pyramid, but it was the only way at the time to start to get women to become full-time athletes. And without that, making the product the best that it could be by them being full-time and training full-time and elite performance environments, we were never going to get anywhere. We were never going to sell the product on TV, get sponsors, bring in crowds. So there were some tough decisions, but I don't, and not everybody will agree with sort of how it was done, but I don't regret it because we had to shift it from amateur to professional, and that was the only way we could work out how to do it. Really was to set criteria that we felt that the bigger clubs would meet and would feel that they had to meet, even if it was public pressure at the time, rather than genuinely thinking that it could be a viable business, which I think most of them think now it can be in the future. And shift that dial into professional football.
And in those kind of moments, obviously, you must have, I suppose, gone through so much criticism and sort of, the public pressure, and, Twitter's it's a horrible little minefield. But every time you make a decision that affects the leagues and affects the Lionesses, obviously there's so many voices around it sort of saying, oh, well, that could have happened. You should have done this. They've made the wrong call. How do you personally kind of, weather that storm and kind of take confidence in the decision that you've made?
Yeah, I think I was pretty active on social. I sort of took it upon myself to communicate the decisions and to respond to people that had a view, whether that was on direct message or on publicly, depending on what it was, and try and explain it. And I think often when you talk to people and you talk to fans, they understand. It's hard sometimes, I think, when they just see a decision come out. So I don't know if I'm allowed to name them or not, so I should pick my words carefully, but there was a team that were in the pyramid. The men's team didn't want them. They were pulling the funding. They were going to plummet down the pyramid. The players were going to lose their jobs, and we made a difficult, what seemed publicly, and many fans were not happy. They told me they knew where I lived. I thought, good luck, come round, the 2 pointers will meet you and rip your head off. And we allowed them to decouple with investors and become a separate club in their own right. You can probably work out who it is. And we took quite a bit of flack for that, but we were left with the decision of, do you turn what is a semi-professional team into an amateur team and allow everybody in that club to lose their job, or do you allow them to continue and thrive with new investment? But it means that they're not part of the overall club anymore, and fans obviously sometimes don't really understand some of those things that you're really trying to think through and grapple. So we took a lot. Took a lot of flack at times, but that's fine because we're all passionate about the game, and we all care. I think I would go to games. Sometimes people would recognise me, and it'd be lovely. They'd come up for a chat. It'd normally be about referees. Oi, Simo, when are you sorting out your referees? But that'd be great then, because I could have a chat with them. So it wasn't too bad. I tried to be as public and as communicative as I could be, and I think that helped.
Well, coming towards sort of the latter stages of your career with the FA, obviously you were just kind of preparing to hand over the WSL and the Championship to the independent company. Obviously, we now know it's WPLL. Can you tell us what the sort of the thinkings and the intentions were behind taking it from under the FA's ownership to a private limited company? How did those conversations start, and how do you think? How do you think it's been so far?
Yeah, so I think, so we did, as I mentioned earlier, we sort of agreed to an ownership review as part of building out the new strategy. We looked at what those different options were, whether it should stay in the FA, whether it should go to the Premier League, whether it should be a club-owned entity like the PL and the FL are. And we looked at the pros and cons of that. And I think, in a nutshell, I suppose really quickly, the FA has got so much to do, so many responsibilities. You share a lot of the teams, a lot of the services with England men, women, FA Cup men and women, etc., and you're scrabbling for sort of resource and time. And you've also got commercial conflicts in there because you might have partners who might be interested in the WSL but suddenly get offered England or whatever. So it didn't feel like the right home for it long term. It felt like it needed laser focus and its own team of experts who wake up, every morning and think, how are we going to drive WSL and the Championship forward today, rather than sort of 20 things that they're thinking about. So the Premier League, it felt like it really needed a strong partnership with the Premier League, and there was a lot of expertise. But I think there was a worry from a lot of people, including the clubs, that it might end up being sort of, bottom of the agenda of an awful lot of things going on in Premier League world. And we've sort of seen, obviously, with the Independent Regulator and all sorts of other things going on in Premier League and attempted breakaways over the last sort of few years that, it probably maybe wouldn't have got sort of the airtime or might not have got the airtime. That was certainly the fear. And so that led to it being a club-owned entity. And a business in its own right, and I think it needs that startup mentality, and it needs a completely dedicated executive and leadership team that is solely focused on it. But it was also, we wanted to make sure that there were protections. So the FA has this what's called a golden share. It means things like promotion, relegation, very topical, that they can't make those decisions without the FA. So the FA have got certain blockers, if you like, on it to protect it in terms of the whole game, and that felt like the right model, and it was certainly the one that sort of everybody got behind. Of course, it's in its very early stages, but it felt like it needed its own voice in that football ecosystem of many male football stakeholders. That the women's game needed its own voice, its own representation, and not to be sort of hindered by, whatever was best for the men's game had to be the voice at the time. And sometimes you suffered that in the FA. I wanted to fight for 3:00 slot on a Saturday. I was constantly sort of batted down because, it wasn't what the men's game wanted. Well, it's got its own voice now to speak and shout for what it wants.
How do you think their WPLL are doing? I know it's a quite a unique thing to do, to step in and take over, and, football is so ingrained in the culture here and we're so protective of it. It was always going to be an interesting transition. How do you think they've fared? Obviously still relatively early on.
Yeah, good. Obviously I know the people well in there, and it's really early days, and they're still sort of building out their strategy and plans of how to take the league forward and take it to that next step, which is probably the most challenging step, which is how to make it really commercially viable. They've done some really good things. Obviously, they extended the TV deal and given themselves revenue certainty for sort of the next sort of 4 or 5 years, and they've extended and grown the Barclays deal. So I think Barclays have renewed 3 times, I think it is. Each time significantly growing its investment. So I think, they've built some foundations so that they can now kick on. I suppose the next big decision for them will be what's the structure and size and makeup of the league, and all of those things that we've sort of read about over the last few months. I guess that's sort of the big next step for them is what does the league look like in the future, and how do they get the clubs lower down to invest more to make the league more competitive. Because I don't know about you guys, but I sort of felt like Sonia was wrapping up the league by Christmas. And I also, although I know a lot of people at Palace did a terrific job, but I sort of felt like Palace were going down by Christmas, and it sort of left an interesting Manchester battle for the Champions League, but that's kind of not enough. It needs, in the design of it, I think it needs as much jeopardy and interest, and we need to pull up some of those bottom investing clubs to make them more more competitive. And those are the challenges that won't be fixed overnight that Nikki and the team have obviously got.
There's definitely been sort of a few proposals that have been put forward this season. We've seen Scottish teams potentially joining the WSL. We've seen the sort of creation of a B League, which might be quite interesting. And then obviously the relegation question sort of popped up, was it last month or so? And as you mentioned there, obviously Crystal Palace being relegated from the WSL. They were the first team ever to be relegated in their debut season. WPLL have kind of announced that we're still kind of waiting for the decision, aren't we, as to whether sort of relegation is going to take place or whether they're going to scrap that altogether. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I know it's a bit of a controversial one.
Well, I've written in The Guardian my thoughts about relegation. I think, of course, the league needs to expand. I think we need to be really sort of thoughtful about how we build as much sort of competitive interest and jeopardy into the design of that. I'd actually like to see more relegation as it expands so that you've got more interest down the bottom of the table. I'm not a fan of no relegation. I think it leaves the bottom half of the table with too many what we call sort of in the trade dead rubbers, games that are meaningless. I advise now clients in professional women's leagues and women's sports across the world, and we often look at competition format. And of course it's those dead rubber games that are the least interesting, have the lowest attendances, the least audiences. So that's my nervousness about no relegation. I actually hear, I don't know if this is true or not, the grapevine says it's dead in the water, so we'll see. Of course it would need the FA's permission. I think the only way the FA could agree that is if there was a significant shift in investment and effort from the clubs as part of that. So there'd have to be something that is brought to the table that means the FA would temporarily close the pyramid, because their job is to protect the whole pyramid and the movement up and down. So you've got to say, okay, well, if all the clubs had to invest X and it was sort of minimum levels or higher levels of salaries and whatever things that we think might move the dial, and you closed it short term, I think people could probably live with that. Mm-hmm. But I don't think what they could live with is owners deciding to sort of look after their own interests and just try and close off the pyramid. And I don't think the FA could agree to that, because they're there to sort of support the whole game. So I think, interesting times. I think Scotland one's interesting, but I did hear on the grapevine that it was leaked by a club in Scotland. That wants
Probably.
I got approached when I was at the WSL. I remember thinking we'll never get this past FA or UEFA. But it's quite an interesting concept, and I do think we should think of it, not just always cut and paste the men's model. So I think some big decisions coming for WPLL about sort of structure and size and how they do that. But personally, I like relegation because I like to look at the top and bottom of the table.
Yeah, I mean, it might not have been exciting necessarily this season, but we've certainly have had relegation battles in the past that have been very, very exciting. And that jeopardy is so important. And when you look at teams like London City Lionesses and Birmingham this weekend, and how both of them could have come up and potentially thrived. So that idea of expanding the league, I think, as well, is really important. And I guess it's also looking at alternative ways to provide more competition for those teams in the middle of the table, and whether that's revamping a League Cup or having a plate competition or whatever that might be, to try and generate more interest in these teams further down that maybe aren't going to be top four, but can at least provide some competition, more fixtures potentially, for teams that maybe don't play as much as other teams. We always talk about overloading. There's also sometimes, I guess, underloading as well. So I guess lots of potential things, as opposed to just maybe copying and pasting what works in other leagues that I don't know would necessarily happen over here or work over here.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. I think one of the big challenges, and this is global, is that there's a sort of an overplay and underplay issue. And you've got those teams who might be knocked out the cups earlier, and the players don't play for England or a national team, and aren't playing that many games. And then you've got the top players who are certainly playing enough games. So, I think it's a challenge in the design. I mean, I never got a chance really to get my hands on the League Cup sort of ran out of time on it. We just had so many things to do, and there's only a few of us. And every year I go, we must review the League Cup, and we sort of kick that can down the road a bit because we had 25 other things that we had to do. It was. I was always sort of stuck on it anyway because the group games gave the Championship much needed more games. But as a fan, it's a bit, the group games, you kind of, the knockout is where the dreams, lie. So then you get, can you pull off a shock in one single game? Yes, maybe. And I'd rock up to watch that. But when it's a sort of group and you've got a chance to sort of climb your way out, it sort of makes it less interesting. That said, of course, it's a great opportunity to blood some younger players who desperately need meaningful minutes. So yeah, I'm glad I've left that one to someone else to sort, because I've not got the answer myself. So left that one with them. But I think the League Cup's part of all that discussion as well.
It sits very closely in our hearts, doesn't it? The Conti Cup. It's always one of those.
Cup,
the Subway League Cup now. Yes, obviously, but the Conti Cup. It feels like it will always be known as that for a little while longer. It's just Continental Tires and their fantastic partnership with.
They did so little effort, but there will always be the Conti Cup.
100%.
It worked.
Or the Sub Cup now. Yeah, we had the Barclays League Trophy, the BLT Cup. But yeah, obviously it has been a very transitional year for the WPL out, and they've had to navigate a load of things. And obviously, like you said, they're trying out different formats and seeing how they sort of, I think take things forward from obviously the legacy that you left. And it's obviously been quite a big couple of weeks, I think, for women's football. Have to obviously mention the transgender ban that the FA announced starting from June 1st, meaning that transgender women will no longer be able to play football in England following a Supreme Court ruling last month. You obviously were a massive champion and, you were such an incredible force in, diversity and inclusion and making sure that, football was for everyone. But how have you kind of taken the news, and how do you kind of feel it's been dealt with by the FA? It's such a difficult couple of weeks for the community.
Yeah, no, very much so. Very difficult. I think I'm going to defend my colleagues and powers at the FA because I know that is not the route that they wanted to go down. So, and I know that because I was involved in the review of policy before I left. And of course, they announced their review of policy only a few months ago. And they'd spent some time really trying to think about the principles of inclusion, fairness and safety. And I think if you start with those, you can't argue with any of those as principles of what you're trying to get to. And so they were just, they were looking at whether they'd got, and I'm not a medical expert, but whether they'd got the right sort of levels around sort of testosterone suppressants that meant that the sort of the differences in strength and power, etc., was I suppose more equal. So they were very much looking at it being inclusive and enabling. I think it's about 30 players, isn't it? I think none in the elite game, but in the grassroots game. So that's not where they wanted to go. They've obviously feel that legally they've been forced into a corner. I saw then that cricket came out, I think the next day, with a similar policy. And I'm assuming that is because they feel that they're now open to and would get legal challenge. So I think based on where we're at with the Supreme ruling, I think the FA need to accelerate mixed adult football as an option so that get those players playing. I think they probably should have done that anyway by now. I was involved with the brilliant Rachel Pavlo in constantly pushing up mixed football. It was at under 11 when we started. I think it's, I don't know, you guys probably know this better than me now. I think it got to under 18. But there should be, in some sports like hockey, you can play mixed, fun, sort of recreational hockey. And lots of sports you can do that. And in football, it's been a bit slow, I think, around the uptake of sort of adult mixed, where, people can make their own choices to play mixed football. And that might be one sort of quick solution to get people playing again that feel that they're now excluded. But yeah, it's difficult. I think it's definitely not where they were planning to go.
And as you said, just I think it was under 30 people involved who had probably found a club where they felt they belonged and were accepted and were able to play the game they love. So just to have the carpet pulled out from them so suddenly is such a shame, particularly in the women's game where we feel, I mean, I know we purport that it's such an inclusive space and there are definitely areas, you know, across diversity issues and that need to be addressed more. But yeah, I do definitely felt sympathy for those people that suddenly could no longer feel involved in the game that we all love.
Absolutely.
Which is always difficult. You're a keynote speaker at a Fair Game conference later this month about the exclusion of women's football from the proposed Independent Football Regulator. The bill is currently in the middle of a lengthy political process and the conference comes just 4 days before MPs will scrutinise the bill. Why do you think women's football was excluded in the first place?
I feel really passionate about this, and I've written about this in The Guardian as well. First of all, I just don't think it was really given any proper thought. I think it's a lot of people from men's football getting round a table and deciding what they want to do around men's football. And why do I think that matters? I think, firstly, there's clearly people feel, including the government, that there's a need for independent regulation and to clamp down on overspending in football clubs that's put many EFL clubs on the brink or gone bust. And I suppose the risk around not really considering the women's game is that as you tighten spend, there's a risk that the women's game spend, which is already limited investment, gets cut. So I think there's some risks that need to be really considered. The other thing that the regulator will have is a backstop power to, if the game can't agree how much money flows down from the Premier League down through the English Football League, then they have a backstop power to sort it. Well, that should include the women's game. It should either be a funding flow that goes to the women's game that got banned for many years and will never catch up in my lifetime. There should be some sort of locked-in regular support like the men's game has, rather than sort of 3-year grants and 3-year this and into some programs. Where's some money? There's a big chunk of the English Football League's club money is basically from the Premier League. Now, if the women's game had a slice of that, it would be, on a different trajectory in terms of its sustainability. But it's not in any of those conversations or considerations. And you could either do that by having a funding flow that goes through the women's pyramid, or you could ring fence some of the funds that go down for women's football. There's pros and cons of both. But so again, we're not in those conversations. And then you look at, I've had to work with the clubs, who many of them are brilliant, but without doubt they're on a journey, just like the FA was culturally, around the women's game. And 10% of the Premier League boards are female, 5% of the EFL boards are female. They are massively behind the rest of society around women in leadership, and I think that shows sometimes in the culture and the attitude and the priorities around women's football. And that could change too through the club licence if equality, diversity and inclusion sort of principles are embedded in best practice governance. So I think it's a big missed opportunity. I've been bleating on about it until I bored everybody senseless, and I'll probably still go on about it. It'll probably be my last words before I peg it. I'll still be going, hey, you need to consider. But I just think, it needs to be thought through properly. And I think Karen Carney was fantastic, but it had no money and no teeth to drive it through. So it's just the government trying to put pressure on the stakeholders to do the stuff in there. But whereas on the men's review, big teeth and a backstop power to drive money differently through the game. So, yeah.
As you touched on, needing more women in the room, because at the moment, we're relying more often than not on a sympathetic ear or someone who understands getting invested in the women's game, as opposed to maybe people who are passionate about it. And that's kind of, those voices in the rooms are so important, so that it's less about, well, this is the right thing to do, and more about, this is a great thing to do. And I think that's where we kind of lacks sometimes at these powerful tables is less about a sympathetic hero and more about a really passionate person pushing it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And treating it as a sort of a business in its own right, rather than a bit of a sort of a CSR kind of charity case while we concentrate on, I mean, you can hear the language that came out of Manchester United, while we concentrate on the first team. No, sorry, you've got two first teams.
Yeah.
And I think now, having held up the women's game for so long by it being banned and sort of blocked, the risk now is that its potential is held up because it's sitting in clubs that aren't treating it like it's a viable potential business. And where I really see that is where they're not investing in off-pitch commercially and in marketing the game. When you take an Arsenal who have been phenomenal and are raising significant sums from matchday revenues that are helping to build Arsenal women as a business, and they've got a really clear strategy for how, on pitch and off pitch, they're driving Arsenal women forward. And you can see that, the incredible work Juliette Slot and her team have done to drive attendances. Now that's taken, leadership and a little bit of investment and some people investment to transform that. Now, everybody needs to do that. Otherwise, you're just holding the women's game back. And that's my fear sort of about clubs. If we don't sort of change some of or drive sort of more diverse leadership and make sure women's football is represented at the top of clubs and football organisations, is that it just sort of carries on in this sort of slower trajectory, whereas we could all be doing what I call an Arsenal.
And looking ahead then, what do you think are some of the next major milestones for women's football? It feels like every single year we have something that's record-breaking, a big achievement, a club doing something special. But yeah, where do you kind of see women's football going in the next 2 to 3 years?
2 to 3, I think. I guess here, there's some big decisions obviously around structure of the WSL and getting that right for its sort of future growth and viability. I'm really excited about the Club World Cup and what that can do for the domestic game globally. I think that's really exciting. We've already seen that it's driven confederation competitions. I think we're spoilt here because we've had the Champions League for a while. Players from all over the world, including America, want to come and play in the Champions League because it's phenomenal. It's sort of, the best v best across Europe. That didn't happen in many of the other confederations. That has all happened now because obviously the winners go through to the new Champions Cup and the Club World Cup. So I think, it's starting to put the structures in place that we've probably maybe taken for granted. So I think, lots of interesting things, I think, for the club game globally and domestically. I think still in am I 56? I think I'm 56. You get to my age, you forget. I'm 56. I think I've said in my lifetime, I stand by this, women's football will be the second biggest sport in my lifetime behind men's football, and I still think it will be. I think it's on a phenomenal growth. I think the World Cup as an indicator is just incredible. That 2 billion people watched it in Australia, 2 million attended, huge revenues as well, and it's predicted to do sort of bigger and better as it heads forward. So really exciting times, I think, for the women's game, not just here but everywhere.
How are you feeling now that we sort of have a 99.9% chance of hosting the Women's World Cup in 2035? What do you think that's going to do for everyone? Because I feel absolutely buoyed by that.
I think it's going to be incredible. Just having the Euros was phenomenal, and I thought my colleagues at the FA and my friends at UEFA and all those that were involved put on an unbelievable show of women's football and an incredible legacy programme as well. And if you think, the World Cup is even more magical and bigger, and will probably be even bigger by then. Incredible. What an opportunity. And what an opportunity for our fans as well to
Absolutely.
See the very best. Amazing.
And finally, I know you give a lot of credit to your team and your colleagues over the years, but did you ever imagine when you started out you would have such a hand in shaping the game the way you have?
No, not at all. No, I came in, I didn't yeah, I went on an enormous learning curve. I didn't really know anything about sort of football structures and stakeholders and how it all worked and what needed to be done. But worked with some brilliant people and some amazing male allies as well. I mentioned Al Wilkinson, Sir Trevor Brooking was another one. There have been a few that really helped sort of guide me and support me to navigate the systems to to get support and investment to put the women's game on the map.
And very, very last question, a bit of an inspirational one. We couldn't not ask, considering we've got one of the biggest people in women's football in the room with us. So what advice would you give to the next generation of leaders in women's sport?
What a question that
Just a
is.
small question to end on.
I think and Emma Hayes is really strong about this. I was chatting to her recently about this, and I know this is sort of her mantra, and I agree. I think just, obviously you come out to do the absolute best you can do for the women's game, and I think sometimes just step back and think, what's the best thing for the women's game? Be brave enough to look at it differently, not just assume a sort of a cut and paste of the men's game, and be, I suppose, brave and bold to drive through what you think is best. But yeah, I'd thoroughly recommend anybody working in it. It's brilliant.